Welcome to another edition of the Giants Huddle podcast, brought to you by Citizens, the official bank of the Giants. John Schmeelk, joined by the one and only Art Stapleton. Art, how are you, man?
What's up, John? How are you?
I'm doing good, man. First of all, before we start, tell all the folks where they can find your written content and all your podcast content.
NorthJersey.com, USA Today, also my podcast, All In with Art Stapleton. You can find that on all your podcast platforms and on YouTube. We are a video, audio combination, just like you guys here at the Giants Huddle.
All right, so Art, I think out of all the beat reporters, you were probably the one that was kind of on this from the beginning that you did not think John Mara would make any major changes after the year. Um, what made you think that, and just what was your reaction to everything that was said once that decision was made earlier this week?
Certainly wasn't looking to take a victory lap, John, in terms of where things are. But, I think sometimes when emotions get involved, we kind of go down a certain road that, might distort things a little bit. And, I joked earlier this week, even after John Mara made the decision public that Joe Shane and Brian Dable will be returning, that the NFL has kind of become that Real Housewives chapter. It's Real Housewives of 345 Park Avenue in New York City because you just can't predict what's going to happen. And the hardest thing in this league is to leave emotion out of it and just treat the situation for what it is. Now, I thought all along that when Joe Shane and Brian Dable were hired in 2022, there was an edict from ownership that we are going to let you build this thing. We're going to let you break it down and build it back up. And then when 2022 happened, there was this emotional high in this franchise. And look, everybody felt it. You had lost for so long. It had been a decade of despair, which is what I coined it. And the reality is that, maybe it distorted a little bit of what the reality was because they did so well in year one. And then now the timeline was skewed a little bit. And I think what you had to reset, and they made mistakes and they looked at things, but it's a first year general manager, a first year head coach. And I truly believe when John Mara says he wants to be patient, I think he does want to be patient. I think he knows that it has turned the organization. I mean, John, let's be honest. You're there, I'm there. We've been there lockstep every day, you and I, not Dable and Shane, and we've been through it all. We've watched it all. History is a precursor. And the Giants, for years and years and years, were all about continuity and refusal of change. And it's flipped. It flipped the script. And I think the hardest thing for John Mara to do was to be patient, but I truly believed that they were going to give these guys another year. I think they were going to be honest with where they're at and just go with it. And that's kind of why I felt the way I did.
Yeah, I want to have the how we got here conversation too, because I think that is complicated and more nuanced than a lot of people want to give it credit for. Um,
100%.
So I think the worst thing that could have happened at the end of the day here Art, was splitting the baby. And look, we've seen that before here when they decided to let go of Tom Coughlin, keep Jerry Reese, right? Let go of Pat Shermer, keep Dave Gettleman, and it creates problems when you're hiring one guy but not the other. There might not be continuity there. Who's reporting to who. We're seeing that in Jacksonville where they've changed coaches but kept the general manager forever, right? We've seen the issues with that. So I think the way I've kind of talked about it, I'm curious what your opinion on it is that would have been the worst case scenario, right? So then you're down to, all right, we either do the full sweep or you keep both. And I just think we both know that when Dave Gettleman was in the front office, he had some good players that he drafted, but the continuity and the way the building was run up there, I don't think was something that ownership generally thought was well put together, really. I think there was some
Right.
conflict and things of that nature, right? And there's been reporting on that. And I think the way Joe Shane has really just completely rebuilt the second floor of the building on that side of the building with bringing in 80% of a new scouting staff, right? Give or take. New people around him in the front office. John Mara used the word process in the press release the Giants put out when they announced that they would be retaining both people. And even though maybe the results with some of the draft picks haven't been exactly what you would like. And as Joe Shane, I believe it was your question that he answered during his November press conference, that look, yeah, I've made mistakes over the past 2 years. Everything hasn't been perfect. That even though sometimes that the results aren't perfect, if the process is correct, the results are going to get better. And I think the results started to get better this year. And I just think the idea to John Mara and Steve Tisch to completely once again upending everything that's been built on the second floor of this building on the football side over the past 2 to 3 years is just something that would be counterproductive for the long-term success of the organization, even though it might make people happy in the short term.
Totally agree, and I think you laid it out well. And I do think, look, you sit in that building every day. We sit in there during, I'm in there 4 times a week, for the season, and then in the off season, we have our time in there for OTAs and draft. But the reality is that I think a missing component here that ownership has to take into consideration is the full business aspect of these decisions and how, when you change your general manager and your coach, you are now essentially changing a huge part of the workforce in your building, and it affects your business. It affects departments that fans and, quite frankly, media and anyone else don't even think about in terms of a functional business. I mean, you're talking about a Fortune 500 company here with the New York Giants and with every franchise in the NFL. And the reality is that when you make changes like that, you are going to have to change everything. And the health of an organization, put the football aside, the health of a business for a decade to change every 2 years and then 3 years, it's devastating to your business. And I think people will look at the bottom line and say, sure, the Giants are still worth, whatever it is, 3 billion, 4 billion, the overall organization with the stadium and everything else. But the reality is that John Mara and Steve Tisch and their families need to be honest about where the business is and where the football is and how that meshes. And I think the best decision for them right now was to give it some more time. You broke it down. Now it's time to rebuild. And now it's time. You've broken everything down. Now it's time to build. And if they can do that, then they'll get to a better place in a year. Is that a playoff mandate? Is there wins, losses? Oh, the schedule is so tough. Oh, what are we going to do? It's January of 2025. Let's relax. Let's see what you can do. You now have an opportunity to build this thing and to take another step forward. The one thing, John, that I laugh at is that everyone always talks about, well, all you guys in the media, all you guys like to go back and still blame Reese and McAdoo and Shermer and Gettleman and Judge and all those decisions. It's not putting blame on them. This is now Joe Shane and Brian Dable's product. But the reality is that if you want to look back and you don't think that the product that they inherited was what happened during those missteps and that they weren't coming in at a different spot, that was the whole idea of you take one step forward by bringing in new people, but organizationally and from a football perspective, you immediately take another 2 steps back because now you're digging out of not only their hole, but now the hole that you've created by completely changing everything again. And so, like I said, I asked John Mara that in his scrum in the field house on Monday. The idea of you talked about the pain of having to start over, but you also talked about your belief in Joe Shane and Brian Dable. What's stronger? Because if you're making the decision because you just don't want to start over, that's a recipe for failure. Are you making the decision because you believe in Joe Shane and Brian Dable and you're acknowledging the fact that starting over would be painful? I think that's a different story. And I truly believe that John Maris still believes in Joe Shane and Brian Dable. And that's where we're at right now going into season number 4 for them.
Yeah, it's not continuity for continuity's sake, right? Because,
Right.
if you're, the expression that I like is that, yeah, continue to going in the same direction is great. But if you started going in the wrong direction, keep going in that direction takes you further away from your goal, right? It's not a good
Right.
thing if you're
Right.
going in the wrong direction to keep going that way. So they brought those two guys in to revamp the organization. I think ownership has liked the way they've done that, even though it hasn't shown up with results yet. And I think they believe, to your point, that they're on the right path and the results will come because the process that they've seen these guys go through and just operating the entire football organization, I think, is something um, that they like. And it's funny, you brought this up, and I've been thinking a lot about this because I remember we had Joe Shane on at the combine. I don't remember if it was before his first season or if it was after the successful season. And the question that I asked him, Art, was, you're coming into in a really tough spot because the team's record was terrible. I mean, I went back and they never had more than 6 wins in the 5 years prior to Brian Dable and Joe Shane showing up. It was either 6 or fewer wins, and they only had 6 once in those 5 years. Um, but at the same time, they had zero cap space, which is really a bad situation to be in. So while there were good players on the roster, they were not in a financial position to keep all those players. And that first year was not even a rebuild year. That was the preface to a teardown year because you couldn't even really tear down that first year because the salary cap situation made that almost impossible, right? So you're tearing down and you're not even starting your build until year number two. Then you have that year that no one predicted, no one in the media predicted. And I think if you gave truth serum to people in the building, no one here in the building would have expected either in that first year those guys are here. There was a reason that John Mara and Steve Schiff brought those two guys in to rebuild the organization because they didn't think they were in a good place. If they thought they were on the verge of a playoff win, they might not have made those changes. You know what I mean? So I think that
Yeah.
kind of surprised everybody. And I go back, you're a Knicks fan too, to the COVID year the Knicks had, right? When Julius Randle had his monster year, they get the 4 seed, they lose in the
Right.
first round to the Hawks, and they think, all right, well, let's try to build this now. And we're going to bring in Evan Fournier. We're going to bring in these veterans to try to push it a little bit. And it didn't work. It failed. And then they had to reset the following year again. And even though it's a year that I don't think any Knick fan would give back, I don't think Giant fans want to give back 2022. But in a lot of ways, it did, I think, divert them from the initial path Joe Shane had them on a little bit. And in the end, I think it did delay things a bit because at the end of that year, I think we could tell by the way they structured the Daniel Jones contract. They weren't all in. This guy's definitely answer. Like, we're rocking and rolling for the next 6 years. They purposely had that negotiation. And I think it's telling that it went down to like the final 5 minutes of the deadline, that there was probably a
Let him
lot
go.
of back and forth on exactly how many years you have dedicated with guaranteed money, how much dead money you're going to have after 2 years, all that type of stuff that you go into those conversations with, right? That they needed an out there. But no sane person can go back and logically say after a playoff win season where you win a playoff game for the first time since 2011 that you can tear down and just all right, fine, just let Daniel Jones walk, let him at free agency, it's fine, don't worry about it. Saquon, he's a running back, let him go, who cares? That's not something you can do. Like no one would have accepted that at that point. So you're trying to split the baby a little bit, and I think that was the start of it. And even without that year, and I go back to my point on the cap, the team they took over was a bad football team, but it had some good young players on it, and it was going to be tough navigating. Well, this is a teardown, but at the same time, we want to keep players A, B, C, and D, because then that takes up cap space, right? And that limits the teardown opportunity. So I do think it was kind of an in between situation in a lot of ways with the way the roster was set up, with the cap, with where the team was performance wise, and just trying and then throw in that first year of success and trying to balance all that in terms of how you build, who you retain, who you don't, how many step backs do you take to take a step forward. I think, and I asked that question to Joe when he first got here, and I think that was always going to be a very tough thing to navigate, even with older veterans like Leonard Williams and Adoree Jackson, right? Leonard Williams was still a good player, but with the way the team was, it didn't make sense to keep him. But you get worse by letting him go. So there are all these, drawbacks and advantages you could take by all of these decisions. And it was always going to be a tough puzzle to put together, especially after that first successful season.
Yeah, and I remember being in the press box in Philadelphia that year, in 2022, and you'd see, we see it a little less now because, the front office personnel, they're trying to not be in a situation where they're walking through with the media in there and with the reporters, and nobody's looking to take victory laps or hold press conferences in the back of the press room every day. But the reality is that I remember It was right around the trade deadline, and asking Joe Shane, everybody thought, remember, John, everybody thought the Giants should go out and get a wide receiver that year. Come on, you got to make a move. You're in position. And this was 2022 when we weren't sure where the way it was going to work out, but they had to win in London and they came back and beat the Ravens, and they were in a little bit of a slide right around that time. And Joe Shane held firm, said, I'm not giving away draft assets. The big name on the board was Jerry Jeudy.
Yep.
Oh, he played for Brian Dable in Alabama. We got to go get him. Throw a second round pick to Denver and get Jerry Jeudy here and, make a move. And then there was such, I wouldn't say an uproar because that's probably too strong, but the idea of what is Joe Shane doing? Why aren't they? This team is in position to compete for a playoff spot. Why aren't they making moves? And their big move was claiming Isaiah Hodgins from the Bills the day after the trade deadline. And everybody was like, oh, they did nothing. What is Shane doing? And the reality is that, 2+ years later, Joe Shane is answering questions about, is he going to make moves to keep his job next year? And if I'm John Mara and Steve Tisch, I look at that first year and I say, you know what? I had a young general manager who probably was feeling the pressure a little bit from his coaching staff. Look, we're here. We make a couple moves. We can compete with Dallas. We can compete with the Eagles. We can win a playoff game or two. Let's get us some pieces here. Let's see what we can do. And Shane didn't do that. He actually held back. I fast forward to this offseason. Had Joe Shane wanted to move off of his plan, we saw John Mara wanted Saquon Barkley here. Joe Shane knew what he had to do to keep Saquon Barkley. It may have gone against what he believes the Giants should do to rebuild, but he knew if he thought his job was in jeopardy, all he had to do was go to Saquon Barkley's agent, Ed Berry. We heard the conversations on Hard Knocks. All he had to do was say, "Hey, we'll give you 14 a year. 14 a year. Saquon's here. Let's be done." And then John Mara walks away a happy man, and Joe Shane looks at it and goes, "You know what? It's not really what I wanted to do, but I made the owner happy, so let's move forward."
And
And
and also, by the way, Art, the team's going to be better in the short term. So that would have been the easy decision to
exactly.
make.
And that's the other thing too, is that when they made these decisions in the offseason, I've said this to somebody, it's kind of, I've developed it as my line. Like, when you're in a mess, it's going to get a little messy to clean it up. And the reality is that that's where they're at. This was going to be a mess, whether it was year one, year two, or year three. Now you've got to clear it up. And it's been messy. It's been hard with the Daniel Jones thing and how that played out in the regular season, and Saquon and Xavier McKinney making the All Pro team and being Pro Bowls. You're going to take hits the way you expected to. But if you have a conviction, you need to stick with that. And I don't think they stuck with that after year one. And I think they're doing that now. And that goes back to, again, they're hoping that they've set themselves up now to be able to get a quarterback in here, maybe get two quarterbacks in here, and follow through and say, you know what? Everybody talking about playoffs next year and wins. I truly believe that what John Mara said the other day was true. Mood. Tell me about what the mood is with this franchise after this year, and then I'll tell you if everybody's coming back or if we're making changes. Because if the mood is that they're moving in the right direction, they have a quarterback, they feel like these young players are starting together, they have another very good draft, which is what they had last year, then you know what? If you win 6 or 7 games and you don't make the playoffs, but you feel like you're heading in the right direction, I don't know necessarily if John Mara's making changes then, if Steve Tisch is saying, you know what, John, we have to make changes. But that's where you're at. So like I said, it's a mess right now. It's going to be messy to clean it up. But after that happens, you hope that you're building towards successful seasons down the road.
Yeah, look, Art, I agree. And this will be my last comment slash question about what happened before, and then we'll kind of look ahead here a little bit. And I apologize for my long retort in between your last two answers,
Not
but
at all. Not at
I, I, I
all.
I think it's complicated, right? And I think what I kind of started thinking about, Duke, and I brought this up on Big Blue Kickoff earlier in the week. Let's say the Giants decided, look, we were going to retain Saquon, we're going to retain Xavier McKinney, We were going to even, let's say they figure out a way to retain Evan Ingram. You go back that far, right? And
Yep.
all those guys get kept, and you're here and you're sitting here. No, not one of us would argue the Giants would be better today. They would have won more games. They would be a better football team. Would they be truly, though Art, be any closer to winning its Super Bowl?
No, no, they wouldn't.
No, you wouldn't be. And on top of that, you wouldn't have your 40 million in cap space. You wouldn't have your 100 million in cap space next year. You wouldn't be picking as high in the draft because your record would be better, right? And I think the record will be better, but I think, and this goes to your point in terms of Joe Shane having a way he wants to go about things, the path to becoming a Super Bowl team might even be even cloudier because while you would have better players, you still wouldn't have the flexibility and the ability to get the key pieces that you need to take those next steps down the road. And again, I think this is the more difficult path to go down, and it requires more discipline. And that's going to be my next question for you. But uh, I don't think to say, well, look at all these good players. They like, oh, why would you do that? Well, to have a little foresight, sometimes you have to make tough decisions now that hurt you now to set you up for more success later. And I think that's kind of what the thought process is here.
I agree. And you know what? It is a leap of faith. It is a searching for benefit of the doubt when the organization hasn't earned the benefit of the doubt
Sure.
from its consumers, from the media, from anyone who's trying to analyze where this team is. And
Oh, and
I
by the way,
get
Art, I don't expect fans to give him that either. I don't think John Mara expect the fans to
that.
give him that either, to be honest with you, because in the end, they're the ones buying the tickets and watching bad football. So I get where
And
they're coming from on
yeah,
that.
and they're spending their hard-earned money. I say, you know what? If you have season tickets, if you have PSLs, the only thing I could say about the one guarantee is if the Giants are bad again next year, guess what? You got a lot of great teams coming into MetLife Stadium to play them, so you can sell your tickets on the secondary market and maybe make up some of the cash that you're losing and spending out on those fans. But look, the reality is that John, all of this is all with the pretense of we don't know if Joe Shane is right. I don't know if they're correct as to how to build a football team that
Oh,
if
there
they're
are no
making
guarantee of results
calls.
here, no matter what path you go down.
No, not at all. I like the fact that they have a plan. It doesn't necessarily mean the plan is right. But as opposed to the previous regimes who didn't have a plan, who, we all saw how that thing fell apart in 2021 before Shane and Dable got here. I mean, there's a reason why so much was made about them having a shared vision and being in lockstep. And this past Monday being the first time that they didn't have a joint press conference. And I don't believe that was a statement about Shane and Dable and their relationship. I just think Monday was a crazy day for them. And they realized, you know what? We got a lot of work to do. And we're not going to spend time and sit up here in a joint press conference, trying to sell you a vision that no one is seeing right now. And I think that's kind of where they're at right now. And like you said, moving forward now to what's next. I always love the analogy and the cliche, the idea of you've got the rear view mirror and you've got the windshield. Why is the windshield always bigger? The windshield's always bigger because you're supposed to see the bigger picture in front of you and stop worrying about the smaller mirror, the rear view mirror that's behind you. But you don't walk into your car, shut the door, and rip the rear view mirror off. There's a reason why there's a rear view mirror. And I think they need to have that perspective moving forward. It's not a blame game. It's just reality of where they were, and they distorted reality because of what they were able to do in 2022. And now, what happened in 2023. And the last thing I'll say is everybody says, well, why didn't they just get rid of Daniel Jones and pick a quarterback? They were now picking 26th because of the season they had. They were probably expecting to have a top five pick with Bryce Young, CJ Stroud, and Anthony Richardson, who came on at the end and became the top three picks in that draft. You are not getting anywhere near that. And if Joe Shane decided, you know what, we're getting rid of Daniel Jones on a playoff year, we're going to trade up from 26 to get into the top five to get one of those quarterbacks. If you're walking into John Mara's office and trying to sell him on that, if you're trying to sell this fan base on that at the time, there's no way that's floating. I mean, and it's possible that if Joe Shane held true to his beliefs, he would have been out of a job. I mean, that's the reality here is that we see what goes on around the NFL and what's happening in New England and what happened in Las Vegas and what's continuing to happen in Jacksonville year after year after year. Somewhere along the line, you have to get off the carousel. It doesn't mean that you leave the building and you say, I'm never getting on a carousel again, but you may look at it and say, you know what? We've got to do what we've got to do to see if we can capture something here. And if you can't do it, there's always next year. Fans don't want to hear that. The media doesn't want to hear that, but it's worth the risk in their eyes to say, you know what? We believe in the process here. We are going to see it through. And it's not a limitless process. The reality is that next year they're going to reassess, but I think that's why all of this played into this decision that came on Monday.
Huddle up, get in here. If you're lined up here, you gotta go over the middle with it to score.
Right. How do we make that happen?
I don't know, but Citizens does.
Make sense of your money with Citizens, official bank of Eli Manning.
Giants Huddle podcast is brought to you by Citizens, the official bank of the Giants. From game day celebrations to your everyday financial needs, Big Blue fans can get the most out of every moment with Citizens. Learn more at citizensbank.com/Giants. And that goes back to your Joe Shane point, right? I think he's shown a lot of discipline in the way he's operated over the past couple of years. I think I remember in one of the Hard Knocks episodes, he referred to himself as stubborn. And I think, in terms of how he wants to negotiate, what his beliefs are in terms of position value, what he wants to pay certain players, right? And I think we even saw that in the draft last year where, look, the easy solution there was just to pick a quarterback at 6, right? Like, Daniel Jones goes off in ACL. That's the easy thing. All right, just pick the best guy. But he's like, no, I think Malik Neighbors is a much better player and has a much higher grade than the other quarterbacks. I'm not going to do the easy thing. I'm going to do the tough thing. And now I think moving forward, and I wasn't sure if you asked this question to Joe Shane or somebody else, but he asked about trying to, again, push the accelerator and win this year now, because obviously the results of last year haven't been good. And obviously John Mara pointed out that the patience is wearing thin for the results. And he said, look, guys, I was brought here to do what's in the best long-term interest of the Giants. And I think if he shows that same type of discipline moving forward, you're not going to run into a situation where you're, backloading contracts, you're trading future picks to move up for a player that maybe you don't believe is the best player in the draft because he's a quarterback. And I think that discipline is really going to get put to the test. And I think based on what we've seen, I think you have to have some confidence that Joe Shane will stick to his principles in this situation. And there's not going to be reaches. There's not going to be reckless salary cap management, because that's just something that I don't think he's shown that he's willing to do in his first 3 years here.
Yeah, and I think whatever carries through here is where Joe Shane, he's building. This was his clean slate. He had to come in and show that he can be a general manager in this league. And the reality is that there have been ups and downs. I mean, look, Hard Knocks offseason may never exist again because the Giants open themselves up to criticism that organizations will not do in the NFL. And I will make the argument that what we saw the Giants go through in their offseason, that's probably the tip of the iceberg compared to what teams go through, how the sausage is made in the NFL. And to see how that was received around the league and portrayed and constantly going back to what was on camera. I mean, there is no arguing the idea of this happened. These things happened. Now, were they taken out of context? Perhaps that we don't see all of the footage and all of the video. But the reality is that Joe Shane wants to work in this league for a very long time. I have no, reason to think otherwise. So if he compromises where he wants things to be, just for the sake of trying to squeeze out a few more wins this year, and then those wins don't come, well, guess what? Then Joe Shane's going to be out of a job, and who knows if he gets another GM job anywhere in the league, because now he's been put out front and center, and we all see how he operates. And, the funny thing is, you mentioned, John, the negotiations. Think about that. Shane was a first-year general manager coming off of a playoff year, and he had to negotiate contracts with the 4 best players on the roster. And this was his first negotiating period for the current team that he's going to have as a general manager. It was Saquon Barkley, Daniel Jones, Andrew Thomas, and, oh, by the way, Dexter Lawrence. So he signed Andrew Thomas and Dexter Lawrence to extensions that continue to look like great deals because yes, I know Andrew's injury and Dexter end of the year injured, but those contracts are going to continue to look good. So all the focus was on those contracts, the Saquon Barkley and Daniel Jones. The reality is nobody's bringing up the contracts for Andrew Thomas and Dexter Lawrence, which are good contracts. And obviously they have to stay healthy and they have to win. So that's the way it is. But, look, I think we keep saying Joe Shane, Joe Shane, Joe Shane. I do believe that they've built around him. I think Joe's done a good job, and that is the stark difference between this general manager and Dave Gettleman is that a lot of times it was Dave Gettleman and the field, but now I do believe it is Joe Shane and Brandon Brown and Chris Rossetti and Dennis Hickey and Tim McDonald and all of their scouts. They feel like they're a team. They feel like they have a process in place. And I think that had gone by the wayside for the two previous general managers that were here. So when John Mara says, I'm here every day, I see the structure we have. That's what he's talking about. He's not talking about hits and misses in the draft. He's not talking about,
Because, by the way, Art, even the best general manager has hits or misses in the draft. It happens to
go back and
everybody.
look at Les Snead in the Rams. And now, Les Snead, obviously, you win a Super Bowl. It was F them picks. Then now the Rams are built because they've made incredible picks with the two defensive guys, with Verse, and all they've done. But Snead's first couple of years were really bad. I mean, it was brutal what they had to do. And then they went off and they pulled off the big trade with Matthew Stafford. And, for years it was, are they ever going to win anything with Aaron Donald? So it's just an interesting scenario that I think front office, when has this timeline been so accelerated to the point where guys are getting fired and they're restarting things 1 or 2 years into the
Yeah.
length of the rookie contracts that you inherited or that you brought in? It's really like, I don't know where it started, but it's really incredible to think that the lack of patience. And again, I get it. Sometimes, guys can't do the job. You watch it, you see it, but it's to think that a front office can have two drafts or three drafts and their first draft class is on year 4 of their rookie contracts, and you're already saying that's it, busts, they can't do it, they're out. We got to bring new people in. I don't know how that's sustainable over the course of
Yeah.
a certain number of years. And maybe it is, but I personally don't see how it can be sustainable.
No, I'm with you. And look, that's not to say that mistakes haven't been made. There haven't been missteps. Joe Shane admitted that himself in
100%.
his multiple press conferences. We're not trying to make that case, but we're just trying to put everything into context. All right, let's talk about next year. Let's kind of work chronologically. Would you expect, or what are your thoughts of potential changes on the coaching staff? And I'll include even Brian Dable potentially calling plays next year or not. I'm assuming we're not going to get that answer until August because we didn't get that the last 2 years either. But your thoughts on what, if anything, might happen with this coaching staff over the next couple of weeks?
Look, everybody took what John Mara said about the defense and tired of watching teams go up and down the field on the Giants this year as a shot at Shane Bowen as defensive coordinator. I mean, look, you brought in Shane Bowen. We knew it was going to be a stark contrast in what you had in Wink Martindale. You had the most aggressive defense that you could possibly have in the NFL. And then even if Bowen was aggressive, it was nowhere near what you were aggressive the year before. I think I don't know necessarily if they're looking to say, well, Shane Bowen is going to be fired and we need to bring in a whole new defense, because I don't know necessarily if that's a great thing for this coaching staff and for the players that are here. But Mike Vrabel is a hot coaching candidate. By the time this airs, who knows? Mike Vrabel might be the coach in New England or somewhere else. Shane Bowen is his guy. So it wouldn't surprise me in the least if Mike Vrabel made a call to the Giants and said, hey, do we have permission to interview Shane Bowen for our DC? And in that situation, maybe that's when you say, you know what, maybe it's best for Shane to go. Maybe it's best for us to kind of restructure and see how this is. But there's no solution right now that's out there that I think you can say, well, it has to be this defensive coordinator that they bring in and it'll change everything. I think they have to, admit and acknowledge the fact that as much as Joe Shane said they drafted for the player and not necessarily for the system. There are players on this defense specifically that were drafted for the Wink Martindale system that maybe had a hard time adjusting to the Shane Bowen system. Tay Banks is one of those guys that, you wanted him to be aggressive and a press man guy. And now this year he didn't play well. I'm not saying that's the excuse as to why he didn't have a great year, but I think that you have to embrace that a little bit more and realize and acknowledge, you know what, maybe we leaned a little bit too much on Wink Martindale when he was here in drafting the players. And that is an issue for the coaching staff. As far as Dable's play calling, look, I think he probably can put together a tape of, 30. I'll limit it to 30 plays that should have been made and were not made in key games this year. And, we all go back to the flea flicker in Germany, but that was up and down every week. You had 3 or 4 plays. Now you can make the argument that you don't have the personnel to make those plays. So why is the play caller, in this case, Brian Dable, still calling those plays? That's something to examine. What happens with Mike Kafka? Is Mike Kafka gone? We know he's interviewing for head coaching jobs. Will he move for a lateral move? Will he stay here? What happens then? Does Shea Tierney take over as offensive coordinator? Do they bring someone? Everyone's talking about Davis Webb. I don't know if that's a move to make here, but the bottom line is I think this coaching staff needs to get together and needs to kind of reinvent a little bit of the way they do things and put more emphasis on week to week changes rather than just saying, what's going to come together. I think defensively they were stuck on that a little bit. I don't know. I think it's a wait and see right now. I think you let the dust settle over the next week or so and see which guys want to go elsewhere. There will be, we saw last year, there were coaches who supposedly, reportedly wanted to get out of here because of Brian Dable and they didn't like the way things were. But I know from talking to some coaches, they wanted better opportunities. There was a coach, that wanted to leave, the tight ends coach, he ended up going to the Chargers because he grew up in Jim Harbaugh's system, or at least John Harbaugh, and wanted to, be with Greg Roman again, that kind of thing. I think we're still going to see how this happens. I don't think it's good for Brian Dable to completely overhaul yet again, but you got to bring the best coaches in here. And if you can get better coaches and you can get a better plan and help your players, then you need to do it. And you need to do it, and you need to do it fast because you can't just boot another season after this. And I think that they have to be honest with where they're at right now.
All right, how do you think they approach the quarterback situation here, Art? I'm of the throw as many darts at the board as possible, veteran, rookie, yes to all, everything. How do you think they're going to approach it?
Yeah, I think that'll be it. I mean, and look, Tommy DeVito is the only player that has a potential of being back. He's an exclusive rights free agent. People don't hear that often, but the reality is they're going to pick up the exclusive rights free agent at minimum contract. If they don't, or if Tommy doesn't sign the exclusive rights free agent, he can't play in the NFL this year. So the reality is when Joe Shane says Tommy's the only one under contract, he's going to be under contract. After that, look, we're going to see how free agency plays out. I think they signed someone. I don't think they put big money into it. Maybe there's a trade to be had if a guy can come in like a Russell Wilson situation last year where, he was pennies to sign. I remember asking Joe Shane, why did you guys talk to Russell Wilson? He said, well, why wouldn't you? You can get a potential backup as a Super Bowl champ at $1 million. Why wouldn't you do that? So maybe they'll explore that opportunity. I still think that they need to draft somebody that is going to bring future promise to this organization. Now, that may not mean next year he's starting right off the bat, but I think, like you said,
does that mean third overall necessarily to you, or a trade up, or could that be a guy at the top of the second round, back end of the first if you trade up?
Yeah, I mean, I think either or. I think the reality is that if I love Shedeur Sanders or Cam Ward, and I have a chance to get one of those two, or I end up writing today. I know this is posting on Friday, but
not. I think we moved it up. I think it's gonna be Thursday afternoon now, Art. So you should be
okay.
safe.
So
Yes.
we're posting, and the Orange Bowl tonight with Drew Aller going against Notre Dame. Talking to some of the the analysts that you and I both respect, who do great jobs, Dane Brugler, Jordan Reed from ESPN, they talked to me about Aller a month ago. Now, Aller ended up saying he's coming back to Penn State, but if he has a big game against Notre Dame and ends up winning a national championship for Penn State in a week and a half, maybe he reconsiders. If he makes the national championship, he has until the 24th, which is 4 days after the national championship. Now, I'm not saying that Aller would be the Giants guy, but another quarterback to consider might change the way the top three picks play out. I mentioned throwing darts. Everyone's talking about Jackson Dart at Ole Miss. They want to say, is he a guy? Jalen Milroe. Look, all I know is that the biggest takeaway from Hard Knocks to me should have been watching Brian Dable with those quarterbacks, knowing that when Joe Shane came back to them and said, would you trade up for Jaden Daniels? And Dable said, absolutely, I would. And we know they like Drake May as well. You have to take that confidence in the fact that in process, again, the guys that they liked and they knew they liked them, they couldn't get them, but look how they're performing. You have to take that and say, you know what? I like Dable's process to pick these quarterbacks, and I will lean on him. And if he says, I wouldn't draft these guys in that spot, don't draft them, or yeah, give me a shot. I can turn that guy into a starter that we need here. I'm leaning on it. That's why Dable's here. If you cannot rely on your head coach in that situation, then you should have just moved on Monday. You need to trust that these guys are going to do the right thing for the quarterback for this organization. So I think you're going to have a free agent. I think you'll have a rookie, and then you move on and let's see how things play out in 2025. Do you have a Kurt Warner, Eli Manning scenario in 2004 when you had them move to that? I'm not sure. I don't know if that's the way it's going to be, but we've seen plenty of examples. Look in Minnesota this year. Look what happened at Atlanta. And there are positives and negatives from both of those scenarios as how it played out. But I think the Giants will be in a situation where they're going to have to, again, make some hard decisions and, then live with the consequences.
If you want to know how to manage 2 minutes of crunch time football, I'm your man. But if you're wondering about a long-term financial plan, you should talk to Citizens. Hey, I can also talk lawn care.
I'd like to learn about a mowing routine.
Yes, I knew I could help.
Make sense of your money with Citizens.
Giants Huddle podcast brought to you by Citizens, the official bank of the Giants. Citizens will donate $750 to the Giants Foundation for each scoring drive during the 2024 season. Learn more at citizensbank.com/Giants. Two more on free agency, Art, before we let you go. I appreciate all the time. This has been fun. And hopefully we provided some context to everything that's going on here for the fans out there. The Giants' own free agents. Let's go there first. We got a couple guys on both sides of the ball that were starters. Greg Van Roten, Jason Pinnock, two of the major guys, Darius Slayton, another, that get significant playing time, that are free agents. Your thoughts on what the Giants' approach to those three guys might be?
I don't know necessarily if Greg Van Roten all of a sudden is going to be looking for a monster deal. Back in the summer when he signed here, he talked about how important it was for him and his wife with a young family to be close to Long Island, where he grew up, where she was from, the idea that, they like their family network here. So I would have no problem bringing Greg Van Roten back on a fair contract. I'm not breaking the bank for Greg Van Roten to come back here, and I don't think he would expect to do that. But he gave you flexibility up front. I would not count on him as being your lock, starter at right guard or even at center, but he gives you that flexibility. As far as Darius Slayton goes, look, I think there's tremendous value there in terms of where he has been on that contract. I think, they made the right call by playing him this year. He was a better wide receiver than Jalen Hyatt was. Now, granted, you win 3 games. Kind of wish I kind of wish they played Hyatt more to see if he could come out of that shell, if you could pull something out of Hyatt. Because now you go into a situation where I don't know if they're going to sign Darius Slayton. I would sit down, I'd talk to him, see what he wants to do. I get the sense that he wants to kind of explore other options and see where he's at. And then, which is what he did a couple years ago, and then ended up coming back to the Giants anyway, when everybody insisted that when Joe Shane forced him to take a pay cut, there's no way he's coming back to the Giants. And he ended up coming back. And that was really the deal that cost them Julian Love because Julian Love and Darius Slayton had the same offer on the table. And when Darius took it, when Julian Love called back and said to Joe Shane, "Hey, I got this deal on the table. Will you guys match it?" They had already given it to Slay, so they couldn't bring Julian Love back. Maybe had they done that differently, maybe we would be talking about safety a little differently for them. But the other one would be Jason Pinnock. It's very interesting to see the value of Pinnock. If I'm the Giants, I'm maybe looking for another option there to pair with Tyler Nubin. You still have Dane Belton on the roster. I like Pinnock. I like him as a player. I think they've gotten a lot out of him since they claimed him from the Jets. But Pinnock may want a little bit bigger deal than what I think the Giants would offer him. So I'd look there, and maybe I can, look at my structure of my defense, what it looks like, and can I find another player for the same economical price that maybe fits better with Tyler Nubin and what I want to do defensively at safety. So right now, I'd say Greg Van Roten will be back. I'd be surprised if Slayton is back. And Pinnock, I'm not really sure what his market will be. So that's kind of where I'd stand with those three guys.
I should throw Azeez Ojulari into the mix. He would be the fourth guy. I think is probably maybe the most interesting conversation of the four, because when he plays, he's productive.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, if you can get Azeez on a 1-year deal to come back and be that third guy with Burns and Thibodeau, I think, that would intrigue me to have him back. You never have enough pass rushers. We all know that in this organization. But if Azeez gets a big money deal, I don't know necessarily if I'd race to go do that. I'd almost rather draft somebody, bring him in, maybe develop behind Thibodeau and Burns. Because, Thibodeau, you've had the 5th-year option question this spring that you're going to have to answer and see where that ends up. The other one that I think is important, John, a guy who is a free agent, and I don't know if I'm going down this road, but Amir Smith-Marset came in, and I think they found a specialist here. I mean, probably the best specialist they've had since Dwayne Harris. Reminds me a little bit of a Dominic Hickson in terms of, believes that he can be a factor as like that 4th wide receiver. So I'd like to see ISM come back here because I think he brought some juice as a returner. And I'm not even talking about the kickoff return for 100 yards. I think he kind of represents something. I don't think he's going to break the bank, but I'd want to bring a guy like that back. He seemed to really mesh personality wise. He brought some juice into the locker room. And again, everybody looks at it and says, you won 3 games. What's the difference? But I think he's a player that they found, through kind of an alternative route to pick him up the way they did mid-season. So he's another guy that I would look to bring back and really, want to get that done before free agency and say, we want to give you a shot at wide receiver, but we love you as a specialist. Come back here, give you a 2 to 3 year deal. Maybe we give you some security. You're home in New Jersey. So he's another guy that I would mention as far as a guy who is free, but maybe not so much free if you make that move.
All right, final question, Art. In terms of the rest of the free agent pie, right, the money you have to spend, Joe Shane said they'll have over $40 million to spend. And to me, I think when we've seen this team go out there and spend, moderate contracts on players, I think they've worked out for the most part. I think that's what you saw the Bills do a lot when Joe Shane was there with Brandon Beane, right? Jermaine Illuminor, good value contract. John Runyon Jr., I think you got pretty happy with the value of that contract. Go back 2 years. The Eshawn Robinson contract, I think, ended up being a pretty good value, right, with what they spent on him. GVR, for the cost of that contract, you get a guy that was a solid starter for you for like 16 games and played multiple spots. That's a win. And I think given where this team is, they have some star power, right? The Dexters, the Brian Burnses, the Andrew Thomases, the Malik Neighbors. I think the way they'll go through this is to try to even out this roster a little bit, fill a lot of holes with some good, solid veterans that you can get dependable play from to fill some of these gaps, to just clean up some of the problems that you've had on this roster over the past couple of years. And I think that's probably going to be the best use of your money. Unlike last year when such a large chunk went to Brian Burns, which, by the way, I think Burns has been great. I think that ended up working out okay as well. But I don't feel like we're going to get that big splash this offseason. I think the pie is going to get spread out a little bit deeper to multiple guys.
Yeah, I think that's kind of their approach. I think, Shane mentioned back in year one the idea of don't shop hungry, and I think the Giants did that back in 2016. And I think if you get Tom Coughlin in the room, he's probably still angry that they splurged on the defense a year before when we knew the defense was really the reason that 2015 just kind of went in the tank. But yeah, I mean, I think the one price point, obviously, we mentioned quarterback. I think they'll look for a quarterback. I don't think it'll be a high price quarterback in free agency. But the other one, there's an interior offensive lineman in Kansas City that a lot of Giants fans wanted a couple of years ago in the draft. And he slipped and slipped and slipped and slipped because he had, blood clots in his lungs. And you know who I'm talking about. The reality is that now he's a free agent, I believe, this year. So he's somebody that I might make a play for. If I'm going to give some good money, that's where I'm giving the money.
That's going to be a lot of money.
And it is, but I'm giving it on offensive line or I'm doing defensive line. Anywhere else, and maybe if there's a corner on the market, I did not look on the market for what the corners were this year yet. But other than that, I like your idea. The idea is that, look, I'm not looking to just get 15 free agents at minimal contracts. The Illuminor contract was a solid contract. Runyon was a solid contract, but now you have those guys coming back. Maybe I'm looking at, is there a center out there? I mean, what are their feelings on John Michael Schmitz going into year 3? Is he definitely the starter? What are they doing, at right guard? I think that's also a spot, and you got to get some players next to Dexter Lawrence. Nacho played pretty well this year, or was at least solid. Wasn't an impact player, but he's there. He's a solid guy to have in a rotation. But Elijah Chapman, you love what you got out of an undrafted rookie, but let's be honest, they can really use an impact player next to Dex. I think Ashawn Robinson was that down the stretch of the previous year. I think you need to find that player to pair with Dexter moving forward and say, you know what, you are not going to double Dex with the guys we have at edge, and then we have Dex on inside. If you're going to run away from Dex, I think it was Burns or somebody said about using Dex as a crutch. It's a positive crutch and it's a negative crutch. When you lose him, it's a crutch, but also when you have him there, it's a little bit of a crutch. Don't just say that Dexter is going to dominate everything because it's not fair to him. You want to take advantage of him and use him to be able to break everything off defensively in a positive way, not a negative way. So that's kind of where I'm looking at for free agency. I think you've got a lot of young players here that it's time to kind of, as Tom Coughlin would say, it's move on. It's time to step up here. So a lot of the guys who got flowers this year, as far as being promising rookies in year 2, these 6 or 7 guys have to be the guys that are forming your core here. And if you're looking to replace them, then that's also a problem and maybe a misread as to where you were after this year.
Yeah, and continuing improvement from the 2023 and 2022 draft classes as well. That's going to be the foundation of the team, absolutely. All right, this was fun, man. Good stuff. I appreciate the time. Sorry for taking a little bit long. Let's keep up. I'm sure we'll be hanging out at the Combine together. That'll be fun, and we'll talk soon, all right?
Sounds great, John.
Art Stapleton, again, check him out. Thanks for joining us on the Giants Huddle podcast, brought to you by Citizens, the official bank of the Giants. We'll see you next time, everybody.